Great. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on housing opportunities for people with disabilities. Next slide, please. My name is Michael Rausch, and I'm the Director of the Center for Disability Inclusive Community Development at National Disability Institute. Next slide, please. Before we get started, we do want to go over some housekeeping tips for the webinar. So listening to the webinar, the audio for today's meeting can be accessed using computer audio or by calling in by phone. If you select computer audio, please make sure your speakers are turned on or your headphones are plugged in. If you do not have sound capabilities on your computer or prefer to listen by phone, please dial 1-929-205-6099. Meeting code is 829-1716-5644. Next slide, please. Captioning. Real-time captioning is involved during this webinar. The captions can be found by clicking on the CC button in your Zoom controls at the bottom of the screen. If you do not see the captions after clicking the button, please alert the host via the chat box. Next slide, please. Submitting questions. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to submit any questions you have during the webinar, and we will direct them accordingly. We will have time at the end for Q&A. If your question is not answered during the webinar, or you're listening by phone and not logged in, you may email your questions to me, Michael Rausch, at MROUSH at ndi-inc.org. Next slide, please. Technical assistance. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box to send a message to the NDI host, or you may email Hope Price at hprice@ndi-inc.org. Please note this webinar is being recorded and the materials will be placed on the following websites: National Disability Institute, Financial Wellness page, as well as the Illinois Council on Developmental Disabilities website. Great. So our next slide, I don't think we have Dennis with us today, so we can go to the next slide, please. So I just want to share with you a little bit, if you're new to the National Disability Institute, we are a national organization working to build a better financial future for individuals with disabilities. We envision a society in which people with disabilities have the same opportunities to achieve financial stability and independence as people without disabilities. We collaborate and innovate to build a better financial future for people with disabilities and their families. Next slide, please. We're fortunate to be doing a project in the state of Illinois, working with a variety of partners in the state, called Financial Wellness for People with Disabilities, and this is in partnership with the Illinois Council on Developmental Disabilities. We'd like to give a special thanks to the Illinois Council on Developmental Disabilities for their support and for being a leader in recognizing that financial wellness for people with disabilities is an important topic, and for helping to build this infrastructure within the state of increasing the financial wellness knowledge of others. Great, next slide. So today what we're going to talk about is, as we talk about financial wellness, it's always important for us to look at housing opportunities for individuals. It's also important for us to look at safe and stable housing, right? And so that's what we will be talking about today. We'll also have time for Q&A, as well as we will have some, share some resources. Before I introduce our speaker, we would like to ask you 3 polling questions. So if you could take a minute and answer the polling questions, that would be great. The first polling question says, how much do you know about supportive housing? You can answer, I don't know anything about this. I know a little about this. I know a lot about this. So you can answer. And then how much do you know about the second question, accessing affordable housing in Illinois? So please submit your answers. And then, do you know how to use home-based services, waiver funding, for supports when living in your own home and not in an agency-run group, home, or CILA? So please take a minute to answer. It looks like we have about 64% of people have responded so far. All right, hope we can end the poll. Great, so it shows that looks like for the first two about supportive housing, you know a little bit about this, the audience knows a little bit about this. How much do you, about accessible housing, I know a little about this, 54%. And then do you know about the, how to use home-based services for support? 48% stated, I don't know anything about this. So that's great. We will ask the questions again at the end of the webinar. Thank you. All right, so now we'd like to get into our main presentation, and we're very fortunate to have Lori Baker, who is the President and CEO of the Association for Individual Development, to join us today to share insight and perspective on housing opportunities for people with disabilities. So you're in for a real treat today as Lori comes and shares this information with us. So with that, Lori, thank you again for joining us, and we'd like to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Michael. I appreciate the opportunity to speak today about a topic that I'm very passionate about, housing opportunities for people with disabilities. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Our mission at the Association for Individual Development, where I work, is to empower people with physical, developmental, intellectual, and mental health challenges to enjoy lives of dignity and purpose. Next slide, please. We serve and support people across the Fox River Valley area, from Yorkville in Kendall County all the way to Dundee in the north, which is in McHenry, Cook, and Kane counties. Next slide, please. So what is supportive housing? Supportive housing is a special type of housing that combines affordability. So a person paying no more than 30% of their income on housing related expenses like rent, electricity, gas, etc., with the services and supports that allow you to live the life that you choose in the community that you would like to live in. So it's designed specifically to meet the needs of a variety of populations, but it's not intended for all people. Some people may just need affordability. Some people may need a different type or choose a different type of housing. But supportive housing is simply affordable housing plus the services and supports that you want and need to live in your community. Next slide. So when we think about affordable housing for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, why affordable housing? Well, traditionally in the IDD world in Illinois, providers like AID own homes where people live. So selfishly, this is a way to have less cost for the service provider not to have to own a bunch of properties. But more importantly, it's more normal. It's like everyone else who gets to choose where and when they want to live based on their income and how they are able to support themselves. Also, if you know anything about the home and community-based services settings role, this type of independent housing fits into that definition very nicely of what a home is. And when you think about sharing your home, how many people would you like to share your home with? 7 other people that you're not related to? Even sometimes I don't want to live with people I am related to. So it is much more usual for us to choose to have a roommate or 2, or live by ourselves if that's what we want. It also makes it much easier to have a place to decompress. Have you ever had a bad day and you just want to be left alone and go to your bedroom or your happy place in your home and be quiet and rest and think about your day, but not be bothered by others? You know, if you don't have some place where you can do that, it can lead to frustration, and it can lead to many of us making behavioral decisions, like maybe being mean to our roommate or to someone who is helping support us because we're frustrated and would just like a place to decompress. When you were 30 years old, did you want to live with your mom and dad? I know that I didn't. People with intellectual and developmental disabilities want to experience life as any other person wants to experience life. And that means growing up and moving out and being independent in your housing and having a relationship with your family, but not having to live with your family all the time. Next slide, please. I like to put this slide in. This is information that comes from the Low Income Housing Coalition. And they do a study every year that looks at what the housing wage is across the nation. And this information just came out last week for 2021. And you can see that Illinois is number 20 amongst the 50 states in terms of the expense of housing. And a person needs to make $22.11 an hour in Illinois in order to access housing, in order to pay for housing without any assistance from any rental subsidy or affordable outside source. A person has to make $22.11 an hour. This is not achievable for many, many, many people across Illinois, because our minimum wage is only $11 an hour. So if you're working at a minimum wage job, or even let's say you're working at Amazon in the warehouse where they make $15 an hour, housing is still out of reach for you in terms of being able to afford a typical 2-bedroom in your area. Next slide, please. So when you're looking at those 2 pieces of supportive housing, affordable housing plus services, let's talk about each one of them independently and how we access them. So how do you find the housing? Next slide, please. Across the nation, there are public housing authorities, or you might hear people call them PHAs. And across Illinois, we have more than 100 public housing authorities. Their job is to provide affordable housing in the communities that they serve. They often have long waiting lists for their resources. They have, in general, 2 types of affordable housing that you can access depending upon the housing authority. Something called the Housing Choice Voucher, or HCV, or you might have heard people call it Section 8, right? People talk about Section 8 housing. These vouchers are used at any rental location in order to make the housing more affordable to persons with low incomes. So a person would pay 30% of their adjusted gross income towards the rent, and the Housing Choice Voucher would pay up to fair market rent from what the person can pay to the landlord directly. The second type of affordable housing that some housing authorities have are actual public housing units or buildings that they own scattered around the community. They are developed with money from the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development, which allows people to build housing much more inexpensively than a regular housing developer, and therefore can charge less money for rent to people who are eligible to access that public housing. There is a resource that you can download onto your Apple or Android phone called the HUD Resource Locator application. If you simply type into your Apple or Android store, HUD Resource Locator, it will allow you to download that application onto your phone, and it uses the GPS on your phone in order to assist you in seeing affordable housing resources funded by HUD, that Department of Housing and Urban Development, in your community. I encourage you to download that and take a look at those resources that are in your community. Next slide, please. In Illinois, we have the Rental Housing Support Program as another means of accessing affordable housing. Some people call it RHSP for short. This program provides rental assistance to extremely low income households living in participating properties. You have to contact those agencies that are rental housing support program providers directly to apply. There are rental housing resources on this slide that you can click on whenever you receive the slides, as well as on the final resource slide at the end of the program. The bulk of rental housing support program funding is managed by the Illinois Association of Community Action Agencies, and I have listed the employee, Philip Gentry, and his phone number there if you are interested after you look at the rental housing resources that are available to see if there is the rental housing support program in your community. Next slide, please. In Illinois, we have a state housing finance agency or authority, as every state in the union does. And ours is called the Illinois Housing Development Authority, or IHDA. You will hear people say IDA, and they aren't talking about a person named Ida. They're talking about the Illinois Housing Development Authority. And the State Housing Finance Authority's job is to create affordable rental and home ownership opportunity for Illinoisans. They receive funding from the federal government called Low Income Housing Tax Credits, or LIHTC, L-I-H-T-C, that they are able to provide through an application process to affordable housing developers who competitively apply for these funds in order to build affordable housing around Illinois. About 20 years ago, IDA decided they wanted to create more supportive housing units within those LIHTC, or low-income housing tax credit properties. So they supported that by setting aside 10 to 20% of the units in a supportive housing project, in an affordable housing project, as supportive housing. The way that people access these supportive housing options that are available all around the state is to working with a social service provider, be placed on the statewide referral network waiting list. Service providers can assist you or your ISC agency, Independent Service Coordination Entity, can help you in placing your loved one on this waiting list in order to gain access to a unit in the community in which you live and want to reside. ilhousingsearch.org is the public website where you can look for housing in the state of Illinois around you, but it also has an internal portal where service providers are able to access that SRN waiting list for people with disabilities who have a 30% or below area median income in order to get on that SRN waiting list. Next slide, please. So people, in order to be eligible for that SRN or statewide referral network, people have to be a head of a household with a disability, experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness, and making no more than 30% of area median income or AMI. If a person receives Social Security disability income, in general, they usually make somewhere between 16 and 19% of area median income. So you can see that many people with a disability would be eligible financially for the statewide referral network. There aren't a giant amount of units. There are about 2,200, but they grow every year as there are new applications and new affordable housing properties coming online every year. When you are looking for affordable housing, it's kind of like playing the lottery. You have to get on all the waiting lists in order to win the affordable housing lottery. Next slide, please. An additional resource provided by the Illinois Housing Development Authority is the Section 811 rental subsidy. This was applied for to Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development and awarded to Illinois in 2 different rounds over the past 10 years or so. This is project-based rental assistance or PRA, which means that the rental subsidy does not belong to the individual, but it stays attached to a specific unit in a specific property. And any person who is eligible and moves into that unit will be able to access that rental subsidy while they live in that unit. It is generally layered onto low-income housing tax credit units, most of the time onto statewide referral network units. And this has a very slim eligibility criteria for Section 811. You have to be an extremely low-income household where at least one person must be an individual with a disability that is 18 years of age or older and less than 62 years of age at the time of the lease signing. And then you also have to be a Williams, Colbert, or Ligas class member and or wishing to move out of a skilled nursing facility or an intermediate care facility for the developmentally disabled or ICF. This is good news for Ligas class members, people that are on the waiting list waiting for services or have been selected in the past 10 plus years off of that waiting list to receive service, because if you're a Ligas class member, you can rise to the top of the Section 811 waiting list. You must be eligible for Medicaid waiver services. because Section 811 is designed to be a supportive housing project with affordable housing provided by the Section 811 rental subsidy and the services provided through Medicaid waiver. Next slide, please. Another source of affordability are just the regular low-income housing tax credit units that are in those LIHTC properties that are scattered across Illinois. As you know, there are some set-aside units, as we just talked about, in those LIHTC properties that are either statewide referral network or 811. But there are also units that are for any person who meets the income eligibility requirements. Sometimes people have higher incomes than 30% of area median income, particularly if you would like to have a roommate and you and your roommate are receiving some kind of Social Security or Social Security disability, as well as working, your income might be over 30% of area median income. And those regular LIHTC units can go up to 50 or sometimes 60% of area median income. Something that we have done at AID is work in concert with low-income housing tax credit affordable housing developers in order to get people that we support with intellectual and developmental disabilities onto their LIHTC waiting list, and then provide traditional quote unquote community integrated living arrangements or CILA in a variety of units rather than in one large property with 8 people or 6 people. That's a really innovative and nice way to work within our system the way that it works today in Illinois. Next slide, please. The Illinois Housing Development Authority has, for the last 7, I believe this is the 8th year, that they have put out an application to community providers and affordable housing developers in order to develop what they call small single-site supportive housing. It's funding that would help you acquire and rehabilitate or build from the ground up a small amount of units, 24 units or less, that are dedicated to a supportive housing population. They are not population specific, so it's not just people with intellectual and developmental disabilities or only people with a mental health diagnosis. It's a group eligibility disability neutral, so any population that we listed earlier, people with a disability, people experiencing homeless, at risk of homelessness, or wanting to move out of an institutional setting, are able to live in small single-site supportive housing. These grants are forgivable loans and grants that, as you keep the property affordable over 30 years, are slowly forgiven. So it's a really great way for providers like AID and others to help add to the supportive housing, affordable housing list of available properties. Next slide, please. So we've talked a little bit about accessing affordable housing. And I know all of this feels very complicated, and it is, but what you're doing today is beginning to learn so that you can think about what steps you want to take with your loved one, and is this an option that you're interested in? You don't have to make a decision this moment. You don't have to make a decision tomorrow. You really don't have to make a decision a year from now, but this is good information for you to know what is possible so that you can begin to think about how you and your loved one want to spend their best life in the community. So we talked about affordability and how you access that affordable housing. Now we're going to talk about how do you access the services or the supportive housing supports. Next slide, please. So there are several different types of service available under the Adults with Developmental Disabilities Home and Community-Based Services Medicaid waiver. There are home-based services, or HBS. There are intermittent community integrated living arrangements, or ICILA. And there are 24-hour community integrated living arrangement, or CILA. These are the basic types of service that are available in Illinois once you've been selected off of the Prioritization of Urgency of Need for Services, or PUNS list. Next slide, please. Many of these services can be used in order for you to have the service piece within the affordable housing. So we're going to start out talking about home-based services. So the home-based services program provides a monthly allotment of funds that can be used to purchase services from authorized community agencies or to pay for personal support workers, PSWs, who are directed by the individual or his or her designee. So in the HBS program, the maximum amount for adults age 22 and older and adults age 18 to 21 who are no longer in special education is $2,382 per month to purchase those services that you would like in order to live in the affordable housing. This is the number that gets updated every year based on Social Security disability payment increases. The annual maximum is $28,584. For some people, this will be enough service to support you in the community living in affordable housing in a way that will be safe and good for you and allow you to have all the support that you need in order to live in affordable housing. But for some people, this is not a high enough level of service. Next slide, please. So intermittent CILA is less than 24 hours a day of support. This type of service is supposed to be based on the needs of the individual and how many hours of service you might need per week in order to live independently in the community in affordable housing. The great thing about intermittent CILA is that the unit that you are accessing is going to be individually controlled by the resident. The resident will sign the lease and have their signed lease with all the complete rights of tenancy as any other person. You could have a roommate if you choose to, or you could live alone if you would like to. You are able to keep all of your personal income, including your Social Security or Social Security disability, and get the support that you need with budgeting or bill paying, shopping, cooking, whatever your individual needs are to living independently. You are able to receive through those hours of intermittent service, not 24 hours a day, but a certain amount of hours per week. The base amount of hours is 15 hours of support per week, and those hours can be increased based on the person's need. So this is a really good model and a way to access the supports needed within the affordable housing to make a supportive housing combination. Next slide, please. So I think I left out a slide, but I'm going to talk really quickly about 24-hour CILA. There are ways to use 24-hour CILA within a larger apartment building or complex where people who are supported together are accessing multiple units, so that it might be 8 people who are sharing that 24-hour support, but they would live in anywhere from 4 to 8 units, depending upon if people wanted a roommate in a 2-bedroom, and there would be 4 2-bedrooms with 8 people living there. Or there is also the ability to have like 8 individual apartments that might be accessed, so that they would be able to have 8 different units individually. There's less flexibility in 24-hour support, but we have been able to make this work at AID, and are working towards making it even more flexible as we continue to advocate with the state. Next slide, please. Can we go back to that slide on yes, thank you, DDD Information Bulletins. So the Division of Developmental Disabilities, underneath the Department of Human Services, puts out informational bulletins that guide the people that work for them and consumers like yourselves on accessing services and supports. And in 2015 and 2016, they put out a series of information bulletins that clarified that in family and intermittent CILAs, 15 hours was the floor and not the ceiling of hours that you could receive per week when using intermittent CILA as a means of support. They clarified the ability to have a CILA in your own home. So that's the individual's home accessed through these affordable housing pieces. And they also increased the behavioral intervention and treatment hours, which makes it possible for more people to have access to some of the services that they need in order to in order to live more independently. So these are important informational bulletins to go back to, because there is still work sometimes to be done in advocacy for you and along with your loved one to actually build the service package that you want. So this is a resource for you to be able to point your independent service coordination entity to, as well as anyone else who tells you it's not possible to do this supportive housing with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Thank you. Can we go to 2 slides from now? So when you're thinking about working with a provider organization, of which there are hundreds across the state of Illinois, next slide, please. There are lots of different ways that you could think about approaching a provider. So a provider is going to support the individual that you love in activities of daily living. They're gonna work on community integration opportunities around all of the things you see listed: banking, shopping, hair and salon services, dining out, going to sporting events, being involved in clubs, recreation. They're gonna include support to develop socialization and communication skills. They are gonna assist with transportation, nursing services, etc. Next slide, please. At AID and many other places, many other local providers have a registered dietitian to assist with special dietary guidelines, and many folks with intellectual and developmental disability are on specialized diets. We also have access to mental health professionals and behavioral analysts and individual and group counseling. That's why it's can be good to work with a community provider. Next slide, please. I wanted to kind of put some pictures into the end of this presentation to show you the possibilities and the variety of ways that providers can work with families. So the top row of pictures are homes that are owned by parents of people that we support. And those people that we support pay rent directly to the parents, and the provider provides the ongoing services and supports within these properties. The bottom row shows duplexes. So it can be a traditional quote unquote 24-hour CILA, but it feels very independent because there are often two people that live in one duplex and two people that live in the second duplex. And so that becomes a 4-person CILA, but you're really living with just one other person. So it's much more like a independent rental type of process. Next slide, please. At AID and at other providers, we have access to a variety of funding in order for us to offer affordable housing options to people. So the top slides are of properties that we developed with HUD funding and that have rental subsidies attached to them that make them affordable for the people that live there. On the bottom are a variety of apartment complexes that have been developed with low-income housing tax credit funding, and our clients became residents by being on either the statewide referral network, Section 811, or regular low-income housing tax credit waiting lists. And we provide the services within the units that are scattered around the larger apartment complex, but the units are the same units as that are accessed by people who simply need the affordability, or for people who need the affordability and the support. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So we have worked with a variety of parents who are interested in providing a different option for their loved one, parents, guardians, friends, family members. And this list of advice is from a parent that worked over a number of years in order to move forward the dream of her son to live in the community. So her advice to people whose loved ones would love to live in the community is to be open and bring to the table when you're talking to service providers whatever you have to offer. So you might own a rental property. You might have a fundraising connection, or know or be willing to help work on fundraising to develop a property. You might have connection to other families that would be potential roommates with your loved one that would make a good match. You might have connection to landlords that have properties that are able to be leased and used for supportive housing. Think outside the box, be creative, and share your ideas. Meet in person with the provider leadership and be persistent. Don't give up when somebody says no, or we're not sure, or we have to think about it. There are a variety of providers, and there are times and ways that you can continue to chip away, and then people become more willing to try something new. Open your mind to the possibilities and don't give up on the dream of your loved one of living in the community just like their peers. Next slide, please. That's my contact information. I believe there's going to be some wrap up, and then we will answer questions. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Lori, for sharing this information. A lot of great information. I think that the importance of this topic, which I'm really glad that we were able to do and have you be here, because you can see that we've received a lot of questions. And so what we'd like to do for the next few minutes is kind of go through some questions, kind of do a lightning round of some of them, and then we'll wrap up and do our polling questions. All right? So, looking at some of the questions we have here, is one of the questions is, what does William Colbert LIHTC class member mean? We received a few questions on that.
Yeah, so yes, I can answer that. So the state, in 1999, the Supreme Court made a decision that any person with a disability has the right to live in the least restrictive setting as possible, even if the state is paying for their supports. And that's called the Olmstead decision. And years ago, probably 10, 15 years ago now, the state of Illinois was sued with 3 class action lawsuits that were based on us not complying with that Olmstead class action lawsuit. And so Williams is a class action lawsuit on behalf of people with a mental health diagnosis. Colbert is on behalf of all persons with disabilities living in Cook County and Medicaid funded nursing homes. And LIHTC is the lawsuit on behalf of persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities, either waiting on the PUNS list, that prioritization of urgency of need for services list in order to access services, or living in an intermediate care facility for the developmentally disabled. And so we were required as a state to do better and begin to serve people in their communities of choice more readily. And so there have been resources over the past 10 years plus that have gone to each one of those classes of involved in those class action lawsuits.
Great. And just to follow up on that, can you clarify that if someone is one PUNS and waiting for services, they are considered to be the LIHTC class members?
They are indeed a LIHTC class member if they are currently on PUNS, or if you've been selected from PUNS over the last, it's been 10 or more years since LIHTC started, so.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then the next one is, how do I get on the 811 list to be moved up?
Could you repeat that one more time?
How do you get on the 811 list to be moved up?
So the Section 811 waiting list is accessed by a service provider. So somebody like AID or your independent service coordination entity can put you on both SRN and 811 waiting lists within that ilhousingsearch.org website.
Okay, great. A lot of questions. Do you have to pass the criminal background part to get in most of the apartments, or is it better to find a private owner?
So criminal background is often a eligibility criteria with those affordable housing options. But the Department of Justice, along with HUD, put out guidance about what criminal background can be looked back at. And it basically needs to be very short term, and it needs to be housing related criminal activity. So if you started a fire in an apartment building, you may have a hard time getting into affordable housing. If you are on the lifetime sex offender registry, you will be ineligible for HUD housing ever. But beyond that, it's all workable. And there are appeal processes around asking for reasonable accommodation for people with disabilities based on their, so if you're, if some of your actions can be attributed to your disability, you can ask for a reasonable accommodation in order to ask that affordable housing entity to overlook that criminal background.
Great. Thanks. The next question is, can an individual receive CILA funding and support if they're living with parents in their home? Would they lose home-based waiver funding?
So I'm not a DDD service expert, but the easy part of that question is if you change to CILA, you do give up home-based services funding and go to CILA funding, because there are two different types of service available underneath the Medicaid waiver. You can get family CILA, which is in your home. It's a pretty complicated process, and you can talk to your individual service coordination entity about that if you need more information.
Okay, great. Then the next question is, why does it seem that most of all the CILAs are in the suburban areas? If I'm incorrect, is there a list of CILAs for the city?
For the city of Chicago?
Yeah, they didn't specify, but knowing this person, I'm thinking it is Chicago, yes.
So there is a CILA finder on the DDD website, and we can probably get that information out to you, but in general, the way that it works is when you're selected for service, your ISC agency will send information about your loved one to providers that you're interested in and see if they have any CILA capability in the areas that you're interested in living. Okay,
great. Then another question is my son does not receive any public benefits and would like to live on his own. It sounds like the resources are for low income. Do you have resources and support for individuals who want to live on their own, but they will need support?
So if I'm understanding it correctly, the person doesn't receive any kind of supports at this moment, but I assume they're on the waiting list to receive PUNS services. If they're not on the PUNS waiting list and are a person with intellectual and developmental disability and have not accessed service, you need to get on the PUNS waiting list. I think that that is the first step that you need to take. Then there are affordable housing resources for many persons. This is not based on the parent's income, it's based on the person who would be head of household, which would be your son, because he's going to move into his own household and be his own household. So as long as he makes somewhere between 30 and 60% of area median income, he can be eligible for many of those affordable housing resources that I talked about. And accessing the service, has to do with being selected off of that waiting list. So you definitely need to get on the PUNS list if you have not done so to date.
Great. All right. So we have just 4 minutes left, and we want to share some resources and go over the polling questions one more time. But a question that has come up multiple times in a variety of ways is, are there housing navigators to help support the right choice for me, the right housing choice for me?
What a great idea. Isn't that great? We are in process of trying to encourage the state to develop a definition of supportive housing services as a approved Medicaid waiver service, and that would help people then be able to get assistance in accessing, completing applications, getting all their documents together, and accessing, moving into, and then maintaining their affordable housing. So we're hoping that we're moving in that direction.
Great, excellent. Thank you so much, Lori. So there's still a lot of additional questions that have come in. Just note that we will take these questions, or everybody's questions, and we're going to answer them, right? And then we are going to attach the answers to these other questions to the webinar recording that each of you will receive. It takes about 5 days for the recording to go up on the website. So each of these questions that have not been answered live, we will take them back and answer them. Also, Hope, while I'm speaking, if you could just pull up the polling questions again. The thing I also want to share with everyone is we really appreciate this great response, and folks are asking, is there more training that will take place on this? This is something that we are exploring and looking at. Also, through the Financial Wellness Initiative, we have trainers who have been trained, and housing choices is one of the modules that the trainers have been trained on, and to be able to share information. So we will be sure to follow up, and thank you for your feedback and sharing. This is a needed topic for us to continue to discuss. And I see that the polling is in, and we have 38% of the people who've answered these questions. And based on the webinar, has your knowledge changed based on the information that was shared? We really appreciate your feedback on that as well. All right, so Hope, looks like we can go on and close out the polling. Great, and then if you could go to the next slide, please. Great, great. Looks like folks have moved to up the chain on the different topics. So great job, Lori. Well, we also just want to share with you that there's a variety of resources that are available. You will have access to this PowerPoint. Here are just some of the resources on this slide. Next slide. And after this webinar, if you have any questions on this project or on financial wellness for people with disabilities, or if you have additional questions on housing, please note that you can send an email to ask@ndi-inc.org. Again, you can send it to ask@ndi-inc.org. Next slide, please. Great, and again, we just want to say thank you so much to the Financial Wellness, to the Illinois Council of Developmental Disabilities for supporting the Financial Wellness Project that has brought this webinar series to you. So we greatly appreciate their support on this webinar. I'd like to say thank you again to Lori Baker for sharing this wonderful information, and people shared, when you talk about this topic, you want to make sure to have Lori Baker at the table, and boy, were we in for a treat today. So thank you, Lori, for sharing this information. I'd also like to say thank you to my colleagues, Hope Price, Kish Pisani, Katie Metz, Lori Schaller, Katie Achenbach, all of the team that helped put this together at the National Disability Institute. Greatly appreciate all of your work, all right? So with that, we're going to close out today's webinar, and we hope that everybody has a great day. Thank you.